Dagmar Morgan is a Love is Moving writer, author, poet, and youth and young adults pastor at Compass Point Church in Burlington. And we're excited for this conversation today, so please be sure to check out Dagmar's essay, Beyond Polarization, about women in the church, which will be in the winter 2022 issue of Love is Moving. So welcome, Dagmar. I'm happy for this conversation.
Thank you. Yeah, great to be here with you.
And we were chatting earlier, we've been emailing for a number of years, but it's nice to finally meet in this sort of face-to-face space here for what I think is an important conversation. And as we were interacting back and forth about your essay, I was thinking about how untangling the involvement of women in the church is a very complicated thing because of historical context, even, today, but certainly in the past. And we're seeing a lot of different books coming out in recent years. I'm thinking of examples like Recovering from Biblical Manhood Womanhood, Jesus and John Wayne, The Making of Biblical Womanhood, that have created a lot of stir around this topic. And I don't know if you are on like theology Twitter, but I've noticed that it's been a fairly vicious and divided space. So I was wondering, just to start us off, like with these sharply different views that women have, everyone has around this issue, and how women can serve in the church. How do we work alongside each other in such disagreements?
Oh, yeah, that's really the big question, isn't it? You can't ever really guarantee that somebody else is going to agree with you. I think that we often think if we make a good enough argument for our side, or somebody else makes a good enough argument for their side, that will maybe shift what other people think. And sometimes it just isn't going to happen. Sometimes people are just not going to believe what you believe. And so that does make it very difficult. So it is a big question of how do we then do that? If I know that, my beliefs are different than somebody else, then what does that mean for women in the church? So, it's very polarizing, and we live in a very polarized world. And so, I think I would default to hoping that we would recognize as brothers and sisters in Christ that we can be different, but we can find ways to still honor each other and understand the other person's viewpoint. I think it gets difficult when it starts to be, detrimental to other people, and people get too maybe overbearing with what they believe and start shutting down possibilities for other people in other spaces. So maybe in your space, that's not something you're okay with, but to recognize that other spaces do that, and that there is a space for that in other places, and to be accepting of that and to be understanding of that, I think is sort of what we really need to strive for. It's not easy to do, but I wish I could say, well, I have the answer. So next week, if we all just start doing this, then it will all work out. But I think the reality is it isn't as cut and dried as that. But I think really working to understand, from somebody else's perspective, why something would be challenging their beliefs or why they believe what they believe, and just trying to be honoring of each other. Sometimes there's going to be places where we can't work with, like if you're going into a space where they're like, well, we don't believe that women should teach, and you want women to teach, then I don't know if you can be in that space necessarily. So I think it has to be a bit of a personal decision in where you are with your walk and where you are with your beliefs, and try to be honoring of other people. It's the best we can do.
Yeah. Have you had experiences where you have had an interaction or like been walking alongside somebody where you had different opinions on this and you felt like progress was made? And I don't mean in terms of who won per se, because that obviously that's a different definition of progress, but I mean around like actually feeling like you understood each other and moved closer towards the truth, which is of course the goal here, right? Like that behind either side, if you want to call them sides, there is a desire for truth, I think. So I don't know if that's something you've experienced and what that looked like is people coming from differing positions and moving forward towards truth and fellowship with each other.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, I've certainly experienced, both extremes of that, where it's been, where it has been, productive and eye-opening, and I've learned something, and the other person has acknowledged that they learned something, and it's kind of made a bridge in some ways between your beliefs and somebody else's. And I've experienced the opposite of that, where it's just been the conversation is just shut down, and there's absolutely no way that you are going to be able to connect with that person. And it's challenging as a follower of Jesus to for me to encounter people who are maybe not willing to soften on their viewpoint, and not soften in the sense of not believe what they believe or water down the gospel or anything like that, but in the sense of just really taking a posture of listening and understanding what somebody else is saying. And I think a big part of it is recognizing that, we don't just come to what we believe, out of nowhere. Each person has had this like long lived experience. They're coming from traditions that have been embedded in their families and in their cultures for generations and generations. And so, where you sit in the world, economically, what your race is, what your class is, all of those, like, there's all these different things. Like, if you're a woman, if you're a man, there's just all these different pieces that play into how somebody believes something, or how they got to where they are and what they believe. And so for me, it's been a very challenging thing to really sit and not judge the other person or jump into the conversation too quickly to be like, what? That's what you believe, but to really sit and listen. But I have to say that when I have done that, suspended judgment and really took a posture of wanting to take a seat, like wanting to see things from their seat at the table as opposed to just my own. It's been really filling, and I've learned a lot. It's pushed my beliefs. It's pushed me to, sometimes deconstruct pieces of things that I believe and figure out why I believe that. And is that what I believe? You get to that moment of questioning, which I think is really important in your faith walk, to constantly be learning and questioning, and trying to understand deeper, because that is how you go deeper with what you believe and what you understand. So the moments when that has happened has been amazing. And I think both people come out of that with something bigger to share with their communities and their congregations and their churches. And I think that alone might be the work of Jesus, just in that moment of how we greet each other.
I want to come back to that, the curiosity that you mentioned and that humility, because I feel like that's a huge piece here, and something that I often see missing in these conversations. Because if you go into any space so 100% sure that you are 100% right, how can you have a productive conversation? So I'm wondering, what were some of the ways that you've learned to maintain that, like, a posture of humility and curiosity when you hear a viewpoint that you strongly disagree with and you feel that like reaction to?
Yeah. I think I've been very blessed in my growing up. I always was, in environments and neighborhoods and lived experiences where not everybody looked like me or believed what I believed. And so from a very young age, I was always interacting with people who were very different culturally, who were different races, who were different beliefs. There was a real spectrum of people. And I think that created in me a sense of that curiosity, because it wasn't a given that when I walked up to somebody on the playground that person would have understand where I'm coming from. And, we come from very different places. So I think having exposure to that is really important. And so I think when we become too encapsulated, where we're not interacting with people from, different walks of life, whatever that may be, like just diversity of people on so many levels, that it does lock down your beliefs, because there's nobody there to challenge it. There's no, it's just what you see and what you know, and that's it. I think there's a bigger danger of that now as well with the internet. So if you're going down, the YouTube rabbit holes, the algorithms, will continue to play you the same thing that you've been looking up, whether it's, something you agree with or disagree with, you're going to see the same kinds of things. And I think it's very easy, even it seems like the world is open to us with this technology. And in many ways it is, but how you use it is really important in terms of what you are exposed to, in the sense of, are you learning more about the world and other people? Or is it just, streamlined where you're just reinforcing everything that you think and where you sit and, like all of that in one space. And so I think knowing that about, internet and social media use, which I think is pretty well known. I'm hoping that, I feel like we have conversations about this all the time. Like, what rabbit holes have you gone down? And, oh yeah, by the way, I mentioned something and now it's in my algorithm, like all the time coming up on my phone, those kind of things. So I think that in some ways we might have to fight harder in this time period to expose ourselves to things that are different and new. And my hope and my prayer is that people will do that they will actively seek out those opportunities. So it's challenging to do, but it's worth it. We have, it's interesting as well that, we have the most diverse, like we're living in the most diverse time and as we ever have, like in a North American context, right? There's so much diversity and increasingly so, right? But then we also live in a time where it's like you can stay in that rabbit hole and that algorithm and never leave that space. And so to me, it's such an interesting dichotomy that we have so much access to so many people and so many issues that we didn't know and understand before, but yet we also somehow still remain even more streamlined and more fenced in. And so I encourage people, if everybody around you looks like you, if they believe exactly what you believe and they're walking out their life exactly the way you do, then I encourage you to step outside of that, because there's so much more to learn and to see, and it can do a lot for your faith walk.
That's definitely a good. Yeah, it reminds me. I think, is it The Social Dilemma, that Netflix show? I think that made a lot, or movie. It was a documentary. It made a lot of people, I think, who maybe weren't as more aware of that. I've definitely heard a lot more conversations about our social media bubbles since that came out. I think that's really helpful. I wanted to come back in your article. I was intrigued that you centered in on this idea. You kind of laid out the two kind of main viewpoints around women in serving in ministry, and then it was a call for unity, actually, and considering of grace, of how we live out those different viewpoints in grace is like almost of utmost importance in terms of how we move forward. I wonder if you could unpack that and why you think that's true, especially since there are people on both sides who would be like, well, no, of course that's not the most important thing because I believe X is right. So I wonder if you could just talk more about that and why that was kind of a place that you landed and why you felt like that was something that you wanted to talk about in the article.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think my approach was I was really trying to not be prescriptive, in the sense of being like, here is the answer to how women should be in the church, or how that kind of thing. Because I know that it's a pretty divisive conversation. And so, researching both sides, understanding like both perspectives, and just kind of like taking a deep dive into each one, I just started to realize, there's a lot of things that I just take for granted from where my seat at the table, and I don't really know fully what maybe other people believe or why they believe that. And so it did, strike something in me that I thought, oh, you know what, I think I need to kind of spend some time thinking about what I believe and why I believe it and where that came from and what has influenced that. Has there been an influence? Is it only the Bible that's influenced that? Has it been culture? Has it been, just kind of asking myself all of those questions. And then through that, I realized that, really, it's a really divisive topic no matter how you try to come at it. And so you can come at it and be like, this is what I believe and this is what I think. But I'm not sure that is the most helpful, because seeing that, I think we have a lot more in common on different sides of things than we think we do. There's some key fundamental things maybe theologically people deal with, or in an eschatology sense, those kinds of things. But at the end of the day, everybody loves Jesus and loves the church and is trying to do what they think is right. I think there is a way that we can serve together and still honor each other's, differences in belief and tradition and expressions of how people walk things out in their own faith. I think you can find your place, and you can find how you fit together without having to be so, divisive about, just like those big things, those big ticket items, like should a woman be a pastor? Should a woman teach? Those kinds of, so those are big issues. They're big, if you're at a church and they don't want women to teach, but you want to teach, then that's a big issue, right? Like that, I'm not sure how you get past that, but I do know that through understanding more both sides of the coin, that it did give me a really deep sense of possibility for us to find a space for us to do that.
Yeah, no, I like that. And I think it's important to put everything in perspective, like not to minimize anything, because I think you're right. Like it's a very, very important issue, and it cannot be minimized. And I think it's important to not be complacent about it. Like it's something we need to kind of be working through, but at the same time, let's not blow it out of the proportion to the extent that we can't have fellowship with one another. So I think that's really beautiful.
And I think in some spaces it might be extreme enough where maybe you can't do that. But I think that it often seems like the majority of it is very extreme one way or the other. And I don't think that's the majority. I think it's a small percent that's very vocal on, that's getting the sort of airtime, and that there's a lot of nuance and difference in even the different traditions of how people walk those out within their churches, within their countries, their culture. And so to focus only on the most, vocal or extreme versions of any kind of belief, and then to think that is the whole thing, I think that's dangerous.
Yeah, absolutely. Again, thinking around sort of the high stakes of this in how it may affect how we think of women and how we treat women in the church. Like obviously one of the big things that are in many people's minds when we think of women in the church right now is related to abuse and the abuse stories that have come out in the church. So what, in your experience, like, in your role in ministry, what are some healthy ways, particularly for women, I think, who right now are hurting, even if they haven't, maybe they have experienced abuse, but maybe they haven't, and there's just sort of that pain, that shared pain that we have around this issue. How can we process that in healthy ways?
Yeah, that's really hard, and it's a big thing to address. So I think there's so many different levels of possibilities of how people could be affected by it, and how extreme that experience might be. So I think in terms of like if you're a woman that is in a church and you have been hurt by that church, or maybe by somebody else in a different space related to faith, then I think trying to, the first thing is always you need to be safe. So trying to figure out what that means for you. And so that might mean like taking a break from that church. That might mean telling somebody. That might mean reaching out to a counselor to, figure out what that means to you. And so I think, I just encourage women to really just to take care of themselves. I think counseling is the first go-to, but that's not always accessible. So if you are experiencing something like that and you are still connected to a church, and you feel comfortable enough, because sometimes you get hurt and then you don't even feel safe going back to that place to be like, can you help me? Because that's what hurt you. So there can be those moments, but often churches have funds that they will help people pay for things like counseling or things like that. So if that's something you can access, whether it's your own church community or maybe a friend's church, finding somebody safe to talk to process it with is really important. And I think just, trying to do everything you can to make yourself physically safe, and then to figure out where you can find a safe space, because you can't begin to process anything until you're safe, right? So it's like a trauma happens to you. The first thing you need to do is safety, right? So if the building is on fire, you pull the person out of the building. You don't leave them in the building, So it's like the first thing is physical safety, then emotional safety, and then you can have a space to actually process. But I do encourage people, and it can be hard to do this, but I think I do encourage people to try to say something to someone. Because if you don't reach out, then it won't get processed. And if it doesn't get processed, then, it just becomes like a landslide of things that effects that have you on you long term. And so I hope that's helpful. I know it's like, it's such a flippant thing being like, well, I'll get a therapist, I'm not saying it in that sense, but in therapy, it is a safe space where you can process with somebody. And I think the other thing I would just small encouragement I would have about people choosing somebody to process that with, is to choose somebody that, you can go to a therapist. And if they don't feel like they're the right fit, you can not go to them again. And we sometimes feel like socially obligated, but in therapy, it doesn't work that way. So you can try 3 or 4 people until you find the right fit. Hopefully you don't have to, especially if you're feeling, like something extreme has happened, but you do have that freedom, and it's an accepted thing within therapy. So, does that answer the question well enough? Like as a first step, at least?
Yeah, I think so. I mean, it's a broad thing, but I think
So much we could say.
reminder, yeah, but that reminder about letting it out, which is often the hardest first step.
Yeah.
And I guess it makes me think another sort of resilience building step is around consider looking around you and seeing if you have like a strong community. I'm even thinking if you haven't experienced this yet, but you want to have community around you so that when you need to process hard things, you have trusted people to turn to.
Absolutely.
Yeah. So maybe turning just to think more aspirationally in the future, like what gets you excited and what gives you hope when you think of the future of women and girls within the church?
I think that the thing that makes me the most hopeful is that, we really see the sort of younger generation coming up, and they are a lot more vocal about things that are wrong. They're not afraid to say things out loud. And I think that we can't really get anywhere, if you're just living in the dark. So I think that makes me hopeful in the sense that, they're not letting the generation that came before sort of rest on their laurels a little bit of being like, well, this is just, how things are there. It's like, no, this is not right. And we want to see a change here. And so I hope that we, take that cue, and run with it in a direction that is really healthy and really strong, and sees the church revived, sees the church like continue to grow, and to see the church be a place that is safe.
Yeah, I hope so too. I hope we listen to the many people crying out. Well, Dagmar, thank you for your time. I really appreciate your thoughts on many, by and large, important topics today and questions. And again, for everyone who's watching this, you can find Dagmar's essay with more in-depth exploration into this topic in Love is Moving's Winter 2022 issue. So we'll put the link to her article as well as details for how you can subscribe to the magazine in the description below. So Dagmar, again, thank you for this time.
Thanks, friend.